This podcast contains content that is graphic in nature and mature language that may be unsuitable for children or young listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Hello guys, this is Kellye, and I'm going to give you a quick recap of last episode, episode 17, part 1. This is going to be part 2, so if you haven't listened to part 1, go back, listen to that one, and then come back here and skip a couple minutes because I'm going to recap it now. And then you really need to get the first episode though, because if you skip it, it's going to be confusing as all hell because it gets twisted in this one. So last episode, we found out that there was a triple homicide of, a Miss Annie Bell Adams, a Idris Eileen Ellard, and John D. Ellard Jr., or he went by his nickname of Bozo. Eileen and Bozo were married, and Annie was Eileen's mom, and her sister Debbie was the 911 caller. She initially said that there was an argument at their house. She left on foot to go up to the neighbor's house where she was calling 911 from, and there was an argument. She took off running. As she was running, she heard 2 shots. She also told police that her boyfriend that also lived at the house, Lee John, was in an argument with him as she was leaving, or something along those lines. So what followed was the police getting there, realizing they had 3 dead bodies, and then a manhunt for Lee John. The only little bit of information that I gave you about the crimes specifically last episode was Bozo's obviously got a gunshot wound to the head because he's missing the top part of his skull. And there is a massive gaping wound on both Annie and Eileen's neck that initially by police at the scene was thought to have been also gunshot wounds, but we find out later in this episode. We'll get more into those specifics. So other than that, they've got Debbie in custody, which I actually need to do a couple of just little small corrections from last episode. Okay. I wasn't sure exactly where Debbie was after her initial interview, because if you guys remember, the officer, Bubba Roy, had picked her up from Mr. Fields' house where she called 911 from. He picked her up and brought her to the scene that morning, left her in the car by herself for about 45 minutes while he was helping gather evidence and stuff, and then went to the car, he said, with a little handheld recorder or whatever, and recorded a statement from her. And that's when they realized or found out that the motorcycle was missing and put a bolo out for that. And anyway, so I wasn't quite sure where she went from that point to the point where she was in custody for obstruction, because they did later arrest her for obstruction of justice, right? So they, from what I can gather, they let her drive her mom's truck, Miss Annie Bell's truck that was at the crime scene. They let her drive that truck back to the Catahoula Parish Sheriff's Office to turn herself in. And that's just from what little information I could actually find on that part of it. Like, it's very not mentioned. Yeah. So she was booked that night at about 7:50 on obstruction. So no idea. Not a clue. All I know is that it was mentioned that she drove herself. So anyway, there was also, because I think I said something before, was that she was initially arrested on obstruction, and she was held until her the next day, or it's been a couple of days actually. Either way, she was initially arrested for obstruction. Just wanted to make sure that was clear. And then I think I mentioned last episode, I think in the intro to last episode, I said something about the April incident from 2012, but I actually found 911 calls and call logs from as early as 2011. There was a July call that a friend of Miss Annie's called and said he was worried about Miss Annie's well-being because Miss Annie told him that Lee John had pulled a gun on her and threatened her life. Now, when actually it was Detective Wiley who was one of the first people on the scene of the murders, Detective Wiley went out and talked to Miss Annie, and she said, no, nobody pulled a gun. No, that didn't happen. Well, then later in January of 2012, Miss Annie actually called 911 and said she wanted Lee John removed from her property. He was cussing and hollering, and she didn't want to deal with it anymore. So there were multiple cases of drunk, disorderly type behavior, stemming from basically within a couple months of him moving in down there with Debbie. So that being said, I think that was only the couple things that I wanted to touch on before we got started on today's episode. So buckle in, guys. This is going to be a good one. Hello, and welcome to episode 17, part 2 of 3, Echoes of Evil. This is Kellye of Sin Law. You know me. We all know me. I'm going to be coming in solo for this episode. Unsure if we'll have Kyler back for the third part, but we'll see. Just busy. Got a lot going on. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this part 2. And before we get too far into the story in 2012, I'm going to take you guys back and we're going to talk a little bit, because at the end of our manhunt, which I don't know if I said this or not, but there were like 7 different agencies and over 40 officers that were a part of that almost 24-hour manhunt to get him in custody. So again, major props to all of those. I think it was Catahoula Parish, Concordia Parish, Louisiana State Police, Jonesville Police Department, Rapid SWAT, LaSalle Parish Sheriff's Office. I think there was a couple of wildlife and fisheries and a couple other ones that I can't think of right off the top of my head. But like, amazing job. Like, wonderful, wonderful teamwork. But they got Lee John into custody. Everybody went home. They got him booked, got him in his prison blues or oranges or whatever they could put in at this point. And everybody went to go kind of, collectively collect themselves. And so while they're doing that, we are going to slip back into the past a little bit and talk a little bit about who Lee John Ponthieux Jr. really was. Now, this was hard findings, okay? This probably took me longer than any other part of this entire case altogether. And there's a lot going on in this thing, but it was probably more difficult to figure out like anything about this man. So this is what I got. He was born on 11/22. Let me double check that here. Yep, 11/22/70. He was born in Cottonport, Louisiana. His dad is obviously the senior. I could not find a single bit of information about who his mother was. It was one of those things that I just couldn't find. We know about his sister because she was in part 1, Shelley. She and he were apparently really close. I think he had at least another sister that lived in the area, the Louisiana area, and I'm not sure about other siblings. It's just not something that I could get a number on. Okay, so his level of education varies a little bit because I saw reports that he left high school his junior year, but then I also got from other court records that he only had a 3rd or 4th grade education, which tends to be backed up by the letters and handwriting and spelling samplings that I have of his. It kind of tends to make me believe the 3rd or 4th grade education. But, some people can go to their junior year and only have an actual 4th grade education. So,
what I did manage to scrounge up, he also had an incident, I think when he was about 16 years old. He was jumped by a group of kids and he sustained, yep, you guessed it, head injuries. And from that point on, family members, relatives said that, he never really functioned the same. Now, from everything that I've gathered and everybody that I've spoken with, he was a very soft-spoken person. He didn't come off real loud. He didn't come off real aggressive, which I'm assuming at this point that was his baseline. And then if he started to drink, then it was almost like a flip of a switch was flipped, and he became the exact opposite, loud, overzealous, aggressive, all of the things that, mean alcoholics tend to be, which is not altogether unsurprising. If you look back far enough, which I did manage to find some information about his father, the senior. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but it's a possibility. What I could find out about him, he had multiple DUI charges, careless operations, and actually the April 2012 call that I spoke about at the beginning in the intro of part 1, Lee John Jr. and Sr. were both involved in that call. Like when they took off, they said in Debbie's car, that was the senior driving the car with Junior in the passenger seat. And I believe for that incident that Lee John Jr. actually got arrested and charged with littering and disturbing the peace. Yeah. So not a good role model from what I could tell. His arrest record goes back to like 67. He was born in 49. So again, 18 years old, like when he could start to have an actual record that we can see to the public, is when he started having an arrest record. And he served multiple DOC sentences, was out long enough to father a couple kids, apparently. But other than that, just all in all, not the greatest role model. Like I said, just based on the information that I could gather publicly. He may have been a great guy, but it says something when the senior, his arrest record starts at 18, and then the junior, his arrest record also starts at age 18. Now, there's no way of knowing for sure if that's the first incidents, which probably not, but we can't see juvenile records, so that's what we go with. And Lee John Jr., he got arrested, I believe it was initially for when he was 18 for the battery of a juvenile. Now, this could be something as simple as him getting into a fight with somebody at school. But if he left it his junior year, he was probably already aged out, or he had already been out of school. But I mean, still like his age group. And if you're over 18, they're under 18, it's still a battery of a juvenile. So that possibly could have been the situation. I don't know specifics. I just know from the rap sheet. So he got that, and excuse me, cats. A couple other charges in different parishes all the way around. Like he had arrests out of Pineville, Rapides Parish, Thibodaux. I think he had some like DeVille area. I don't know. But all the way back to age 18 in the year 1988, he's had these cases. And most of them were like burglary, theft. He actually stole a truck of somebody's, and then he had like simple criminal damage to property. There was an indecent behavior with a juvenile, but I don't believe that one was actually, he wasn't convicted of that. So the other ones are just like resisting and disturbing the peace and careless operation and things like that had to do with alcohol-related issues. So from what I understand and from what I could see, the majority of his life and adult life from the time he turned 18, he spent in jail. He was sentenced and convicted for he stole somebody's truck. I stole it. He borrowed it. And then he was sentenced to 4 years hard labor. Okay. Now he had earned trustee status, but he took advantage of that and had an escape attempt. And in that escape attempt, he actually stole a 4-wheeler. So when they caught him, and they did catch him, they sentenced him to 10 years hard labor consecutive to his original 4-year sentence. So from my addition and things, after he was released, he moved to like the Morgan City, DeVille, that kind of area, Mansura, where I believe his family was originally from. That, bounced all around in there for a little while, working as like, he worked on tugboats, he worked as carpenter, handyman, he worked in a shipyard from his own words and story. And then I believe it was, I want to say 2009-ish, when he went to the wedding of his sister, and that's where he met Debbie. And according to him, they met at the wedding, and she moved him in the same night. And that's where he had been for the past 3 years. And to all his reckoning, they were in love, and he loved her more than he'd ever loved anybody else, and he'd do anything for her, and so on and so forth. So that gives you a little bit of background on Lee. And yeah, I mean, and at the time that he was arrested, that August 2012, 21st of 2012, he was actually working at a pecan orchard. Yeah, there's a thing down here. And he was making about $100 a day. Unfortunately, good amount of that, a percentage of that, was going to his probation fees, fines, and court costs. Because, like I said, the littering and disturbing the peace in April, and then he had another one that was a misdemeanor charge before then that he had also pled guilty to, that he was supposed to have been paying on already, and he wasn't. He had a bench warrant. Like, it was a whole thing. But they had released him, I believe it was May, and put him and continued his probation with a new payment plan. And that's when he got the job at the pecan orchard. So he's living in the house with Debbie, has been living there for about 3 years. And, yeah, it came to this. So we're going to get into that now. So on August 21st, after everybody had taken a nap, they come back, and by they, I mean our chief investigator, Mr. Tony Edwards, and Bubba Roy, another detective for the Catahoula Parish Sheriff's Office. They come back up to the jail and sit down for an interview with Lee John. And it's about 3:00 in the afternoon, because like I said, they were trying to make sure that he was sober. 2, they were trying to make sure they had the clearest idea in head of, how to approach it and where to go, and try to get as much sense made of what they had found at the scene and everything like that, and to just try to get a good, starting point to go in there and begin this interview, because they don't know what he's going to say, what he's not going to say, and so on and so forth. They didn't really have to worry too much, because he was very forthcoming. And like I said, they went in there about 3:00. The interview, the first one, only lasted about an hour. And they, like I said, when they were at the scene processing, they assumed that all 3 victims had been killed by gunshot. Well, Lee John is about to rock the world a little bit. So this is what Lee John says in a nutshell. Because like I said, this was about an hour-long interview, and they go in there and they just ask him, run it back. Tell us what happened. And the biggest part that I think needs to be said is he is very inconsistent. He is very unsure. He says, I don't know, or I can't remember, more times than he says any other phrase or set of words in this entire interview. And it just, a lot of it is just, I can't really remember. I was, I blacked out. There was just a lot of vagueness to everything. So when they start this interview, they're asking him about that day and what had happened, and talking about what led up to it, the events that led up to it. So his story went something like this. They had started drinking, he said, sometime between 12 and early afternoon. So they were having a quote-unquote party, or birthday party, celebration type get-together for a friend of theirs that lived down the road. And there were 2 guys who had come, and they were drinking beer and hanging out at the house. And he tells them it's been like they drank like 2 cases of beer, plus they had some energy / alcohol drinks, you know, those things, guys, the ones that are like Red Bulls, but they have like an alcohol content. Yeah, not a good combo any way you look at it. And then he also mentions the fact that, you know, they were taking pills, like he said Xanax, and then another one that looked like an orange football or something like that. And so he just mentioned a lot of drinking, drug use. Okay, let's see what we got. We'll see. You know, this started to make a little bit of sense. And, you know, he said we went through 2 cases of beer, and then eventually we went and got another case of beer, like we stocked back up. But then about the time that it started to get dark, which this was August, and so it'd probably be about, I don't know, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And that the 2 other guys had left, and so it had only left the core 5, Annie, but Miss Annie had been inside the whole time watching TV and like hanging out in the house. She wasn't a part of the drinking outside or whatever, obviously. But the core 5 were home at that point, Debbie and Lee, and then Eileen, Bozo, and Annie Bell. Okay. So at some point, he says that Debbie and Eileen got into it about something, because they're always getting into it. And I think one of his quotes was, they get to drinking, they get into it. Basically, he says that anytime they were drinking, that they were arguing about something, whether it was how Eileen didn't feel like Debbie was taking the best care of their mom, or how Debbie was really upset because none of the other 6 kids, siblings of hers, would come and help. Even though she was getting paid to look after her mom, she was still kind of bitter that nobody would come and lend her a hand or give her a day off. And so they always were getting into some kind of argument or another. Not to mention the really big sticking point in Debbie's side, Eileen and Bozo, you know, the married couple, which we'll get into that a little bit later, but Eileen and Bozo got married in January of 2007, which was a short, I don't know, I want to say 4 months after Debbie and Bozo got divorced. Yeah, you heard that right. He married Debbie first, and they got divorced as of September in 2006. And Bozo married Eileen, Debbie's younger sister, in January of 2007. Yeah. So this was basically a big old pot that it basically was a powder keg inside of a pressure cooker that was also sitting in the heart of an active volcano. It was going to explode. There was something bad that was going to happen. Not to mention the fact that you've got a violent drunk that is now a part of this whole equation, which was also a point of contention basically for all of Debbie's siblings, saying that he didn't need to be there. He was only causing more problems, which seems to be true based on just the 911 history. So all of that aside, though, you've got major contention and stress and strain between the sisters, and then also between Debbie and her mom, because she's the only one that's taking care of her. She's got that resentment there. You know, she claims in all of her, later we'll get to it, but she gives statements to the police. And so in all of her stuff, though, she's always talking about how much she loves her mom and that was all she had to live for. But you could also tell that she was resentful of her siblings not helping and not doing anything to you know, free her of having that burden, I guess you could say. So there's that resentment that they've got. And you've got Lee John that is, like I said, known to be violent, aggressive drunk, and they're drinking and doing whatever recreational drugs that they're choosing to do. And you've got Debbie and Eileen getting into it at some point in the night, according to Lee John. And then also, according to him, they kind of go their separate ways. So Lee John and Debbie go into their room in the house, and Eileen and Bozo are outside in their shed. And Miss Annie's in the house, and they're getting ready for bed. He said it's probably closer. At this point, it's probably closer to midnight. And Debbie's still going on and on and on. She just keeps on and keeps on nagging and bitching and nagging and moaning and groaning and talking about how her life would just be better if they were all dead. Somebody should just kill them and get them out of, because her life would be so much better without any of them in it. Talking about not just Eileen and Bozo, but also her mom, because, aside from feeling like she may not have been a burden, she also kind of had that, she let them move in here and she knows how bad they did me. And because, according to Debbie, Bozo had cheated on her while they were married with her younger sister. And, supposedly she had gotten over it and it was water under the bridge. But you could tell in everything that I read that was always something that came up no matter what. It was always, well, she took my husband. So, yeah. So it was always a thing. Always a thing. She obviously wasn't over it. So when he's telling the story about, being in the house after they'd come in and they had been drinking all day now, and Debbie just keeps on, and Lee John just said he got tired of it. So he said, okay. So he got up, went into the kitchen, grabbed a butcher knife, came back into the room, and this is his story again. He comes back into the room, shows it to Debbie, and says, is this what you want? And his statement's not exactly clear, but he says something along the lines of, she didn't stop me. She didn't tell me not to. So I took that as kind of a go ahead, or I bet you won't. Something along those lines. So then he goes ahead and he walks into Miss Annie's room, and she didn't really make any kind of movement because apparently Lee John would go in and help and do things for her and at the night and just try to be helpful. So Miss Annie had no cause for alarm when he walked into the room. And at that point, he looked back, saw Debbie standing in the doorway, and proceeded to stab her. Now, according to his first statement, he says he stabbed her twice. Okay. And then, but again, peppered through in his entire testimony, even through all of these parts, it is, I don't really remember. I don't know. Maybe I did. Maybe I think it was. I'm not sure. Maybe it was, a lot of that. And that could have to do with the fact that he was drunk and high, or it could have the fact that, due to the fact that he didn't actually do it, or, there's a lot of reasons for that. But so far, this is what we got. So, and Tony, Chief Investigator Tony Edwards and Detective Bubba Roy, they both did an amazing job not leading, not trying to get him to say something based on their information. So they did a really great job in this interview interrogation, because they let him speak from his own memory and lack thereof. So anyway, so they keep going in this story, and I don't know. I think I did this. I think I did that. So at this point, he says, I got the shotgun that was from behind Mama's door, and he called Miss Annie Mama. And that's one thing he gets really upset in the interview, and has to be, he has to calm himself down, because he's really upset about what happened to her and the fact that she was dead now, because she was, he cared a lot about her. According to him and according to his reactions, he never called her Miss Annie or Annie Bell or anything like that. He called her Mama. So he says that he got the shotgun from behind her door. He knew to be there. Everybody knew it was there. And he knew it was loaded. And he said he went outside at that point. When asked where was Debbie, he said he didn't know. But later he comes back around and says, well, she followed me out there, or she was outside when I shot. But again, unsure, very inconsistent. So they go out, or he goes out, knocks on the door, because he intends to kill them too, because that's the other part of Debbie's, frustration and issues in her life. And so for them to be able to be together and to be happy and to stop all of this going around and being upset all the time, and just this major life hurdle that they've got to get over, they've got to get rid of all the problems. So that includes Mama, sister and ex-husband / brother-in-law. So he goes out there with the intent of killing them, knocks on the door. He tells the cops in his first statement that Bozo opens the door and he shoots him. And now, obviously, this can't be true because of how they found Bozo. He was feet away from the front of the house or front of the shed. And if he had shot him as soon as he opened the door and hit him, all of the matter that was found on the ground and spread out in the yard would have been inside the shed, or at least part of it, most of it, like the majority of it. But there was no such evidence. There was no such blood spray or anything like that to corroborate that. So obviously he had his story wrong, right? So, Tony Edwards, he confronts him about this information and the fact that it doesn't jive. And, well, maybe he came out. Maybe it was the second shot. I don't really remember. Again, inconsistent all the way through. So he says, he moves the story around where I don't remember where he was when I shot him, but I shot him in the front. Like I shot him. He was looking at me when I shot him. And then he talks about Eileen coming out, trying to attack him, which choice of words, but she tried to jump on him and take the gun from him. But according to him, he'd already shot, if not twice, at least 3 times, which means at this point, because all shotguns that are sold and regulated for hunting, they have a plug put in them. So they have the capacity for only 3 live rounds at a time, 2 in the barrel and 1 in the chamber. So he shot 3 times, which is evidence of the crime scene as well. And so they've got the gun at this point. The shotgun is useless, although Eileen still tries to wrestle it from him. And he says at some point he lets go of the rifle, or lets go of the shotgun, and reaches into his pocket to where he always keeps his pocket knife. It's a Gerber pocket knife, the same one that they found on him when he was arrested. He says he pulls that out of his pocket and proceeds to, excuse me, Kitty, he proceeds to stab her. And again, when they asked him how many times, he said, I stabbed her a few times. And according to the statement now that he has given, this is all new information except for the gunshot wound to Bozo. Because remember, when they roll up to the scene, they assumed that everybody had been shot. Even in the evidence video, he talks about them being shot in the neck area. But now that they have this confession from Lee John, they realize that they've got knife wounds. They've got, these horrendous looking wounds that they saw on these bodies were not from a gun. They were from a knife attack. So now they've got to resituate themselves. Now they already and I want to say they kind of assumed as much, because when they found him and the Gerber pocket knife was in his pocket, it did have a bloody hue to it. However, we live out in the country. It could have been blood from damn near anything. But now they knew that knife was of extreme importance. And they also knew now that they had to go back and search again, to look for this other knife, which, all he could say about it was the butcher knife from the kitchen. Didn't have a color. I think he actually did say that it was a black plastic handle maybe from the kitchen, but that was all he could give them. And so they had to go, at this point they knew that they had to have to go back and search for that. Well, then they asked him about, like, where did you hide out after you got arrested? And how did you manage to evade us? For, all of those questions. And basically he says, well, after I stabbed Eileen, I was trying to find Debbie. I didn't know where she'd gone to. I figured she might have gone up to Scott's. So I got the keys for the motorcycle of Bozo's were always left in there. So he got on the motorcycle. He said he put the shotgun under his butt. So he was sitting on the shotgun as he took off on the bike. Okay. Awkward. And not only awkward, but drunk. So that was why he did not make it any further than he did. And ended up with the motorcycle in the ditch. So at that point, he says he was just trying to find Debbie to figure out what had happened and how this had all gone wrong. And that's actually a direct quote. He said, I was trying to find her so she could tell me what happened, because his mind is still foggy and still very unclear. So he goes and he's sneaking around trying to see if he can see Debbie, but she's not there. And he can't get any glimpse of her because she's not in that place to be seen. So he eventually, takes a nap out past the house, and then works his way back down the woods, down back to Miss Annie's house, watches them leave, goes back in. And at this point is when he tells them that, he went back in, he changed his shirt because that other one was gross. It had like sweat and it was just nasty. They asked him if it had any blood on it. He said he didn't remember. And he said he changed his shirt while he was in there, grabbed some more beer, grabbed some more shotgun shells out of the house, and then called his sister. And the reason he said that he got more shotgun shells was because he was going to kill himself. And he actually says in his interview, but I couldn't do it. I had the muzzle or the barrel in my mouth, but I couldn't pull the trigger. I wish I had killed myself instead. So they get all of this information back. They realize that, that it wasn't anything crazy special. It was, and they asked him about how close the bloodhounds had got to him. He said probably within about 20 feet. Yeah, it's crazy, right? So he tells them all this, and they ask him, like, why on earth, if you love Miss Annie this much, why would you do this? And he said, well, because I love Debbie more. I would do anything for her. And, she just said it so many times. Every time they argue, every time we got to drink, and every time they argued, I just wish they were dead. I just wish they were dead. And when they asked him, did you do this because you love Debbie this much, that you would do this for her, that you would kill them for her so that she could be happy? And he said, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I did it. It was because I just snapped and was tired of hearing them argue and hearing her bitch about it all the time. And the yin-yanging, I think is how he put it. And that's what he decided he was going to do it for her so that she could finally be happy. So with this new information, like I said, they've got to go double back and go search, see if they can find that other butcher knife, see if they can find any other evidence there at the scene that they weren't looking for to begin with. And also, they've got Debbie locked up for obstruction. And now they're starting to see that this was a little bit more involving her. And if what Lejon, in this version that he gave in his very inconsistent and very vague and very blurry version, is to be believed, Debbie was there and witnessed her mother being murdered, and when she got to Scott's house, she literally only said that they were having an argument and she heard gunshots. She never mentioned anything about Lee having a knife, having stabbed her mother. In fact, when she called, she was actually worried about him shooting her dog, and she wanted the officers, when they got there, to check on her dog. Yeah. Okay. So they go to talk to Debbie. But not that day, because that day they're going to check evidence and do all that good fun stuff. So they wait till the next day at about 2:30, 2:45-ish, and they go in there and talk to her. And again, it's Bubba and Tony, and they sit down and they start talking to her, and they ask her about the day. Okay. So she basically tells them the same story. We were drinking pretty much all day, and I don't really know those two other guys. They were out there talking with Bozo and Eileen and drinking or whatever. And real quick into the story, they realize that her story she's sticking to, they were outside tussling, scuffling. And that was actually one thing that Lee said that didn't happen. He said, I never got into a physical altercation. Maybe I should have instead of what happened. But Bozo and I never got into it like that. And so that's the first thing Debbie says is they started to get physical. She saw Lee throw Bozo down on the ground, and that's when she got scared and ran off. Okay? Ran off to Scott's house. Now, this didn't make any sense. Okay? Doesn't make sense to them. It didn't make sense now. Didn't make sense then. And if you listen to her statement and the way she's talking about it and the way that property's laid out, why the ever loving hell, if they were out there arguing and fighting outside the house, would you not just go in the house and call 911? Like had been done at least a dozen times before. Okay, so there's problem number one. Problem number two, they've got Lee John saying that they were in the house. They were having conversation. They were, she was bitching about always having to deal with everything and her wishing everybody did, and that they had already come in for the night. And that is actually bolstered by the fact that Debbie was in her pajamas. Eileen was in her just a pink bathrobe. Bozo, he still had his belts, socks, jeans. I don't think he had shoes on, but like he was still half dressed, I guess. But Eileen was in her bathrobe. Annie Bell was in her night clothes, and so was Debbie. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense what Debbie was trying to pitch, that she was outside, Eileen was, that whole thing just didn't jive. Not with the crime scene, not with Lee's story. So they finally, after about 35, 40 minutes, and Tony Edwards, he gets into her. He doesn't kitty gloves her by any means or stretch of the imagination. He finally gets her to admit that she was there when Lee first stabbed her mom, and that she saw that. And this story, her versions change at least 3 to 4 different times in just this 1 hour interview that they do. And hers is a little bit more consistent. I just mean like consistent in the way that she tells it. So she doesn't have a lot of blackouts. She doesn't have any blurry moments. She's still very coherent. The inconsistencies come with her story changing because they call her out on it, and they call her out on the evidence of it. Because initially they thought, well, they had done it together and that she had held the shotgun on the motorcycle when they took off and then crashed the motorcycle. So she went up to Scott's house. I don't know how they actually thought that one through, but she was very adamant about some things. And then the other stuff she was, not as adamant about, and would get kind of defensive in her answering or questioning. So when it comes down to it, she ends up saying that she was there when he stabbed her mom, but she didn't want him to do it. She never said that. She changes her story. At one point, she admits that she said that she wished they were all dead at least 4 times in the past. She swears she didn't say it that night, or she might have. She doesn't remember. And then she changes it completely to, I never said that. I never told him that I wanted them dead. I never said my life would be better if they were all dead. And this is just within a couple minutes of the same interview that they're in. And it's a little bit wild. I think it started to click in her mind that if she had said those things and they believed, and Lee believed, that doing it for her would somehow make her life better, and that they could go on and live this happily ever after together if they just got rid of the quote unquote problem, and he did it by proxy for her, then in her brain, she's clicking things together and realizing that means I'm in trouble too. Because even if she technically didn't wield any weapon, if it was in some way her idea and she didn't stop him, then she's just as liable, right? Okay. So they get this interview with her, and at this point, they are now both booked on first-degree murder, 3 counts. And when their bond is set, it is set at $10 million each. And it's set the next day. After that happens, they actually go and talk to Lee John one more time, see if he's got anything to clear up or any kind of details that he might have forgotten. And he does. There's a couple of things that he clarified, as like the footprints that were in the shed on the bedding, like the bloody footprints. He said he went in there to try to get a pack of cigarettes or something, because he knew that they kept cigarettes in there. But, who knows? Who actually knows? So that's where it sits for a good long while, until October, I believe. So they were arrested October 21st. Bond was set at $10 million. I think it was on August 23rd. And then October, what day was it? I forget. Okay.
October 15th, 2012, the grand jury indicted Lee John, but they did something different for Debbie. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick explanation here for everybody because we try to bring the legal system to our true crime here. So when it comes to a grand jury, it's different than a normal jury because basically they are trying to decide whether or not there is evidence to support a case for the prosecution, right? So they convene in secret. They have strict confidence, but then that's for two reasons. Witnesses that will testify in front of a grand jury have zero fear of retaliation, and it also protects the defense's reputation if it's not a true bill. So if they go in there and they're accusing somebody of murder, regardless, nowadays you're going to have public out the wazoo regardless, right? But it's still trying to protect the reputation of the defendant in the off chance that it's not true, or in the situation where it isn't a true bill. So there are three ways that a grand jury can decide. They can decide a true bill, which means they believe that there is sufficient evidence to proceed with a trial. A not true bill, which means there is not enough evidence. And the third one is the interesting one, and this is what they did in Debbie's case. It's called pretermitting, and this is basically like a hung jury for a grand jury. It means that they're waiting until the entirety of the investigation is completed. And basically that just means you don't have enough evidence, but we think there might be something here. We don't want to say it's not true, but we're not going to say that it's true either. Okay. So 9 of the grand jury members must concur for true or not true. And if they have a vote for pretermitting, they have to have at least 9. So it has to be a majority vote of 9 always. If 9 cannot be reached for true or not, that's when it becomes a hung jury or a hung grand jury, which ends up in it being pretermitting. Okay. So this is a procedure that is similar to the preliminary hearing. There's a huge difference there, though. The preliminary hearing is done and decided by a judge, and he decides it on probable cause. And it's the same thing, though. They're judging and weighing the amount of evidence and if there's enough to proceed to trial. Big differences, like I said, though, is a judge for a preliminary hearing. It's open to the public, and, the prosecution, defense, the defendant, all of those people can be present because it's open to the public. The grand jury, like I said, is very secretive and done in strict confidence. And, that is done by the grand jury, not by a judge. So keeping all that in mind, they ended up pretermitting Debbie's indictment. So at that point in October, she had been in there since August, and according to stuff that I got, I don't think she was actually released until a little bit later. I think she was in jail for like 180 days or so, something along those lines. But she ended up getting released a little bit later. Her attorney at that point filed a motion to get her out because they hadn't reconvened the grand jury because they hadn't brought any new evidence. So, but as of October 15th, Lee John was indicted. He was then, sent through the roller coaster. He was appointed a public defender. I think eventually it became Daryl Hickman for the defense, and they went through all the normal course of motions and suppressions, and he tried to get the interviews, quote unquote confessions, thrown out or suppressed, and that didn't happen. So they move on, and eventually they come to a trial in December 16th. They started jury selection, and this took most of the first day, and they ended up with, get this, 10 females, 2 males, and then a male and female for the alternates, which I thought was pretty crazy. I haven't seen a split like that in a while where it was a great majority female to male, or vice versa even. Normally it's a little bit more, divvied up, but, and, so I just thought that was interesting. Now, they had opening statements from the defense attorney and for the defense. Brad Brigette was the district attorney, and his opening statement was about 30 minutes, and he touched on the fact that, I'm going to give you this evidence. I'm going to show you exactly in black and white to the letter and so on. And, the defense, basically their entire argument hinged on the fact that they were blaming Debbie for all of it. That, Lee didn't have any motive. He didn't have any reason to want any of those people dead. Debbie had all the motive. She had all the rage and hostility and all of the things. So that's where it was sitting. All right. Now, as the trial begins to unravel and fold, they call the officers that first arrived at the scene and the dispatch who answered the call, the 911 call. They also called the arresting officers that found Lee John in the woods and that testified to what he had on him and what, where they found him and all that. And then they call the forensic pathologist who talks about the autopsies of the bodies. And this is where we get into some interesting points. Okay. So they talk about Miss Annie Bell. And trigger warning, gets pretty rough. Skip ahead or, just be warned. Miss Annie Bell had 12 wounds. Now, that is not indicative of actual injury. So let me explain a little bit better. She had 12 separate wounds, but it's not entirely clear if they were all done separately. So she could have had, she had been stabbed at like 6 times and received 12 wounds. Does that make sense? So the major damage causing were the 3 to her throat. There was one specifically that severed her, her jugular all the way through her, larynx all the way across, basically. It all the way down. Again, this was the butcher knife. So it severed all of those. And then basically she bled out from the stab wounds. She also had, some defensive wounds on her hands. And you could tell that, she had tried to fight a little, but she was an elderly, 76-year-old lady at the time. She was on oxygen. I believe she had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, just overall moderately poor health in general. Like she had to have her daughter live in and was being paid to take care of her to be able to help her because she just couldn't do as much. She had a handicap ramp on the porch. And she could still get around and walk around, but not a lot. Like she was very limited. So not much of a defense could be put up. And so they had the majority of the focus of the wounds, though, were on the neck. And I think she had one on her face and her cheek, and then the small or slight defensive wounds on her hands. And they determined that Eileen she'd been stabbed and cut. An unknown amount of times, but it resulted in 23 separate wounds. These were majorly focused to her throat, face, and hands. She also had defensive wounds on the front, back of her hands, as well as one on her leg, almost kind of like trying to use her leg as a defense to push back or push away from the attack. And then in the struggle had been stabbed or gouged in her leg as well. So both of those, according to the pathologist, seemed to be killed out of rage because and if you're a true crime fan, you'll know this already, that most times a knife attack, it's very personal, it's very up close. And if you're stabbed more than just once in like a fit of either like self-defense or, like a panic kill, a panic stabbing, which it happens. But if it's anything more than like 1 or 2 quick wounds or jabs, if it's anything more serious, like 12 different wounds or 23 different wounds, that generally indicates some level of some level of relationship. The more, I don't even remember which one it was, but one of my true crime people said, the more stab wounds, the more personal. So, and they also indicate that it's depending on the area of where they are stabbed. So in like a sexually aggressive or like a revenge stabbing, it could be focused in the groin area or something like that. it's very personal. Stabbing, cutting, those kind of killings or murders are very, very personal. So that leads you to the next question of, well, what the hell is Lee doing personally stabbing these two women? Excellent question. We'll get to it. So now we're talking about Bozo, which is a whole other bag of worms, right? So if you remember from Lee John's statement, he said he shot him while he was looking at him, like he shot him from the front. And then he fell backwards on his back, and that's how he was found by the cops. And that's what the police were led to believe as well. Like, they thought he was shot from the front, and it took off the top of his skull, right? That's not how that happened. The wound trajectory came from the base of his skull at a slightly upward angle from the back left occipital, which is, that bottom left part of your skull, and towards the front, and it came, and the trajectory was almost midline forehead by the time it was exiting. So how the hell did he shoot him in the back of the head? Another thing that he did not get correct in either of his statements. He never said that he shot him from the back. Anytime he said he shot him, he said he shot him from the front, that he was looking at his face when he shot him. So inconsistency after inconsistency. And another kind of inconsistency, both Eileen and Bozo had very minimal amount of alcohol in their bloodstream. They had no drugs that popped up on their drug screen outside of what was prescribed to them and was within therapeutic levels. So they weren't drunk, they weren't high at this time. It doesn't mean that they weren't drinking earlier, but the levels that they were at that point were low enough to be considered like not even, they were both well under the legal limit. I mean, I think Eileen barely had anything in her at all, and it could have even been contributed to decomposition at that point, although I think they were still in rigor. But regardless, they weren't drunk, they weren't high. So it sounded more like a Lee and Debbie were drunk and high and all in their feelings, and Lee figured that he didn't it, if you want to believe his story. So they get like I said, the forensic pathologist. They even get Mike Stelly. Hey, buddy. Mike Stelly, our weapons expert, our firearms analyst. He gets up there and he talks about the shotgun itself, which is a pump action Remington 12 gauge, and talks about the fact that it's a pump action. You have to manually eject and, knowingly cock and reload this weapon to be able to fire it again. So it is a very thoughtful process. You don't just mindlessly pull the trigger. You have to work at it. You have to put effort into it and make a conscious decision to load it again or eject the cartridge and keep shooting. So he testifies that the gun that they gave him, that they found on Lee's person when he was arrested, was in good working order. The safety did work and all of the things were functional. Now, noticeably to me was the fact that the shell casings that they found at the scene, which I think they had maybe 6, they didn't get those analyzed. So we don't know if those shells were shot from the gun that was found on Lee John's body, which blew my mind. But I could think of a very, very good reason as to why the district attorney might not have done that. Because he probably didn't have enough faith in the fact that those came from that weapon. Now, out in the country, we have shells, especially out where you can shoot from your own backyard. There are going to be shell casings everywhere. And when we used to live in Oklahoma, we had the side of the hill that we would shoot skeet from. And you go over there and you see, it's almost like a shotgun shell graveyard. They're everywhere. And so in their minds, if they have these shotgun shells that are at the scene, the quote unquote scene right there by the shed, they think they're the ones that came out of this shotgun. They think they were the ones that, possibly could have been the ammunition that caused the death of at least Bozo. But on the off chance that they didn't come from that specific shotgun, even though the ammunition was the same type, they were known to have other weapons there. They were known to have other guns on that property. So if that specific shell that they are saying was used in the crime doesn't match up, that is a reasonable doubt. That is a reason that is a hole for the defense to stick his stick in and stir it all around and say, hey, they don't even know if this was the gun that shot him. They don't even know because if that ammunition doesn't match up to the weapon and say that it was fired from the shotgun that was on Lee John when he was arrested, they can say that maybe somebody else got a shotgun and quote unquote Debbie, that she had a different weapon, shot them, and then, Lee John wanted to take all the blame, so he took off with a shotgun and she ditched the real one or whatever. There's plenty of ways that you could poke holes in that, right? So just to err on the side of caution and don't test the bullet casings, because why would they need to, right? He has the gun on him. He has the pocket knife that has the blood on it, which was tested for DNA. It did have Eileen's blood on it. Also, it had Annie's. And it also had DNA from Lee John, which of course it would because it's his knife. But they also couldn't eliminate Debbie from that DNA pool that they found on the knife. So that's the Gerber pocket knife now. They never recovered the butcher knife. Never recovered it. Lee John said he threw it in the river. Then he said he threw it on the trash side of the river. And then, they never got it. They never found it. They looked for it. But they never found it. They also never found the shirt that he said he changed out of. Yeah. So there's no telling. But they didn't test the shells to the weapon. They didn't match that they came from the gun that he was laying on. And that bothered me. It bothered me. It still bothers me to this day. So anyway, regardless of all that, they get through the witnesses. They, like I said, they talk about the DNA where they did match it up. Now, interestingly enough, here's another point that I would have dug my heels into in the defense attempt. The clothing that Lee John was arrested in, that they took off of him, the boots, the pants, the shirt, and I don't remember if he had a belt or anything like that, but definitely the boots and the pants. In an attack like that of which that ended Eileen and Miss Annie's life. Now, Miss Annie, she was on a bed, okay? So if he is crouched or kneeling on the bed, I could understand how that may not have had as much of a splatter or a spray of blood. But you talk about the amount of defensive wounds that were on Eileen and the fact that she fought hard to stay alive, and the wound that killed her almost cut all the way to her spine. So a lot of blood, a lot of spurting. And when you're attacking someone with a knife in that manner, that's going to go everywhere. And a lot of times, in a lot of cases, and this is like majority of all cases, if they don't have some way to stabilize the knife in their hand, the blood and everything else will make it slippery and will cause injury to the assailant's hand or the suspect's hand. And that's one thing that I noticed that was noticeably absent. There were no pictures of neither Debbie's nor Lee John's hands on the date of the incident, on the date that they were caught, on the date that they were arrested. They weren't entered into evidence. I couldn't find hide nor hair of them or any hint of them or having been taken at the time they were arrested. So there's no way of knowing. And it's a possibility if they had, or if somebody had noticed, then maybe I don't know. It's long gone in the past now, but I'm just saying that's something that, you would think that would be, a big thing to look for. And I have not in any of the research I've done, in any of the court documents, police reports, any of it, no mention of pictures or anything like that of, even mentioning the fact that their hands did or did not have injuries, So you've got that. You've got the clothes that Lee John was wearing when he was arrested. 0 blood found. Not a drop. She tested like 23 different areas on the boots. Of course, she probably could have tested the entire thing, but 23 different areas on the boots and there was not a speck of blood. How does that happen? And the same thing on the pants. And like I said, I could maybe understand Miss Annie because she was in the bed and with the crouching and having your legs, kind of covered by the bed if you're on your knees over the top. But when you're struggling with Eileen, that blood's going everywhere, right? I would think so. So to that point, the boots, the pants have no blood.
And even with it raining and him going through the woods and everything, there still would have been microscopic. It would have been there, right? Because water doesn't degrade DNA. Not enough. So no blood on the pants, no blood on the boots, no really, really bad confession. Like he's very wrong about everything that happened. Like he just doesn't describe the events as they happened according to the autopsies and everything else at the scene. So you'd think after all of that that they'd find him innocent, right? Or not innocent, just not guilty, because there's too many inconsistencies. It doesn't make any sense. He couldn't have done. Oh, I mean, he probably could have, especially when you talk about, and I don't even know if they introduced it at trial, but the amount of times that he had been called, that they had called 911 specifically on him for his aggressive behavior. But yeah, they didn't take long. It actually was a 4-day total from the time they started the jury process. 4 days. So it started December 16th, and I believe it was, oh goodness, I lost my spot. Where did I go? Am I in the right one? Okay. So 4 days total. And the defense was basically, Debbie did it. She had all the reason to do it. And if she didn't specifically do it, she's the one who, it was her idea. She made him do it. And on the 4th day of trial, after the state rested, the defense only called one witness. That was Debbie. She was in court with her own attorney, Robert Clark, at her side at the jury box, or at the witness box, testifying. And funny enough, she actually pled the fifth to more of the defense's questions than she did the DA's questions. Anytime they started asking anything specific about that night, up to the point where she was talking about like the party and what had happened and that they were drinking, anything past that, really, she kind of pled the fifth. But it was a funny, inconsistent way of pleading the fifth. She'd say, yes, I don't know, plead the fifth. So she'd answer the question and then plead the fifth, or she'd say, I plead the fifth. I don't know that answer, or whatever. So it was kind of funny. It was interesting to read anyway. So not a whole lot gathered out of that testimony, but she managed somehow to bring up the fact that her sister married her ex-husband. She also managed to bring up the fact that her siblings didn't help her out any with her mother. And yeah, so like I said, she didn't do a whole lot of good for anybody, but she kind of bolstered the defense's claim of like, hey, look, she had all the reason, all the motive, all the motivation to want these people dead, not Lee. So his physical details didn't match. Debbie was a useless witness, basically. There were things in the investigation that didn't get done properly. And I honestly feel like they could have played into that a little bit more, but as on a whole, he brought the points up about, the shotgun shells not being tested, that they didn't test for fingerprints, but why test for fingerprints when they had DNA, and so on and so forth. So they get down to the nitty gritty. The state and the defense both rest after Debbie gets down from the stand. Lee John doesn't testify in his own defense. And then the jury gets their instructions and they're excused. And it was about 48 minutes later, I think, under an hour, they came back with a verdict. Now, this is where it also gets a little bit more interesting. They found him guilty of all 3 counts of first-degree murder. However, they polled the jury. Now, they were unanimous on Eileen and Bozo. Okay? But for Miss Annie Bell, the jury polled 11-1. So there was one person who did not believe that Lee John was responsible for killing Miss Annie, which came up later in his appeal because you have to have a unanimous for first-degree murder. But we'll get to that in just a second. So he was found guilty of all 3, and he was sentenced. I think they actually waived sentencing, which was also a point of an appeal. because they waived waiting, the mandatory cool down period or what have you, even though it's automatic in first degree murder. They're going to get life without parole, but they waived waiting the amount of time which they're allowed to do. And he was sentenced to life without parole to be served consecutively 3 times over. So with that, he was sent off to Angola. And interestingly, when he initially got to Angola, he was put into the psych ward. He was having a really hard time adjusting, and it was kind of eating him up, and he was having nightmares and such, according to what I read. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the letters that he wrote while he was still pre-trial, before his stuff was finished. And I'll get into that more in the next episode, because we're already almost over an hour here. So let me just real quick talk about the appeal. He submitted it saying that the 3 consecutive life sentences was unconstitutional and excessive. They also appealed on a second error of sentencing him less than 24 hours from the time of the ruling, but the appellate court found that the defense attorney was actually the push. Like he, in the transcript, he said, it's happened before, we're okay with it. And if there was going to be an objection to that, it should have been done then. And then they could have ruled or you could have appealed on the basis of that should have been granted if there was an objection in court at the time, and there wasn't. So as it stands right now, his appeal was affirmed as of December 10th, 2014. There are no other appeals that I could find, and he is currently an inmate at the David Wade Correctional Center in Homer. So the step down, not Angola, but one beneath that, the rollover. So as far as I know, that's where he's at, and then that's where I'm going to leave you guys for this one, with him in jail and his appeal denied as of December 10th, 2014. And when we come back on the next episode, part 3, we're actually going to go a little bit earlier back in 2014 and start with Debbie's section and part, because it's going to be a crazy one. So we'll get a little bit more into detail, and we'll get a little bit more into detail and go over some of the stuff that I left out of this one that pertains to her as well, because I didn't want to give too much away. All right. Thank you guys. Stay awesome. Happy New Year. And I appreciate you guys listening. Give us a like, a share, a follow, a review, a rating. And you are bound and determined to get in here, aren't you? Shoot me an email if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I love you guys. See you next time. Take care out there.
This has been an Elf Audio production.